In this episode, I speak with the inspiring Kathryn Hansen. She is the author of the incredible book Brain Over Binge. This is a book I recommend to every client I work with who is struggling with binge eating, as so commonly we see anxiety and binge eating going together. But what I love about Kathryn's approach is it really gives us a practical way of understanding how the brain is working in a debilitating eating disorder like binge eating and bulimia. It shows how our brain is responding outside of our control. It's not your fault. It's okay that your brain is behaving the way it is, and there's a way to work with it and overcome it. I hope you'll enjoy this discussion, particularly if this is something you've experienced in your life. Perhaps you're going through that binge purge cycle at the moment. It is one way that we can deal with some elements of anxiety, but as Kathryn goes into it, it's also partly a pattern of the brain, a habit of our brain and the wiring that we can overcome. You'll learn so much in this episode. Share it with any friends, family in your life you know might be struggling in this area. And I think this is important information for everyone to know. Okay, let's go to the show. Welcome, Kathryn Hansen. I am so thrilled to have you joining me today.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much.
So I recommend your book Brain Over Binge to my clients all the time. It was something that was really helpful for me in my own binge eating journey, which is something that obviously you're so fabulous at helping people with. And so I would love us to start with just one open question. Go wherever you like with it. But what is it that you just wish more women knew, especially when it comes to binge eating?
Very simply, what pops into my head is don't diet because that is like what leads to binging. And when I say that, a lot of people think, oh, you mean we can't eat healthy? You mean you have to eat junk food all the time? No, that's not it. But when you put your body in that deprivation state, that is what creates this uncontrollable desire to binge. So I think there's a lot of, pressure out there to look a certain way. And it's tempting to follow that, but that's how you get yourself into trouble. Like you have to nourish your body. So, yeah, don't diet, nourish your body. That's my simple advice.
I think what was so eye-opening for me in hearing your story and the way that you approach binge eating was the concept that it's not just completely depriving yourself of food that's going to result in that rebound effect of the binge, of your brain kind of jumping into survival mode and okay, well, we got no food, so we got to kind of like make up for lost time and go into that and make sure we've got plenty of food available. But there's also, it can also happen when we just make harsh food rules on ourselves, like dieting or saying we
Mhm.
can only eat these foods. It has a similar effect on our brain to think there's not enough in general.
Oh, yeah. I think it can be a mindset. Like dieting can not just be restricting calories, it can be, like you said, restricting food groups, restricting like just, the types of food that you're eating. And it can definitely become something that leads to a lot of perfectionism and that leads to a lot of anxiety as well.
Well, that's exactly the community of women that we're speaking to today.
Yeah.
So, and interestingly, binge eating and emotional eating is incredibly common as a way of, you know, interweaving with the elements that lead up to it, such as our insecurities about our bodies, leading to us restricting food and so forth. It's also that way of coping with the anxiety. It's numbing out. It's not needing to feel feelings, and food being such a available option for that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I mean the relationship between anxiety and binge eating, it's very kind of complicated in some ways. There's many different directions it can go. There's some indirect connections, there's some direct connections. So yeah, I'm excited about diving into that relationship today.
beautiful. Before we do, I would love for you, obviously, you go deep into your story in Brain Over Binge, which is, I'm so glad you do because you really are so honest and vulnerable in that account in a way that when I share this with my clients, and I know how I felt about it as well, it's just so relatable, beyond relatable. Like, I don't know any other account of a troubling relationship with food that is just so wow, like you're in my head. And so I would love for you to just give a bit of an overview of where you started with all of this, where things started to go from, not caring about food and body so much to getting into that place of feeling like you're in trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Now, like you said, Brain Over Binge goes into a lot more detail, and I'll do my best to kind of summarize things without going on for too long. And I'm also a much better writer than I am a speaker, but I'm trying. And I appreciate, everyone here listening. So what happened for me, it was a diet. It was something I sort of fell into. I started restricting calories. It was after I had my tonsils out. So it started just not being able to eat because of that. And then I was like, oh, I lost weight. And that was kind of what my friends were trying to do at the time. And I just didn't start eating again normally. And I started just restricting types of foods. I started restricting fat. That was a big thing at the time. It was like reduce your fat intake, which, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that, as a young girl growing and maturing, like to not eat fat. It's terrible. Um, so I just started losing weight. I started, in a way, it was reinforcing because there was some attention, there was some improvement. And I was a track athlete and cross country runner, and I improved a little bit for a short time, but then things really started going bad quickly. My appetite just felt out of control. I started slipping every now and then and overeating, and it was nothing like a massive amounts of food like I did when I began to binge, but it just led to some stress for me. But I still like really tried to get control of my appetite. When I would overeat, I would compensate by trying to run more and trying to restrict more. And then it was actually in high school, my last year of high school, I binged for the first time. I woke up and I just had this uncontrollable urge to eat massive amounts of food. And I ate tons and tons of cereal and just couldn't even move after. And I was like, oh my God, what did I do? And for anyone who hasn't ever experienced that, it's very unsettling and it's very hard to understand if you have not experienced that. It just feels like you're kind of watching yourself do something you don't want to do, and then afterward you come back to your senses and there's so much shame and so much regret. And this just started happening over and over. Like it started, maybe once every 2 weeks, and then it increased, and eventually it was 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. And I tried to purge like through self-induced vomiting, and thankfully I was not ever able to do that. But my form of purging was over exercise. So I would binge and then I would exercise for up to 7 hours of exercise, of cardio, trying to work it off. And it exhausted me completely. It took away any life that I had. It was just miserable. But there was this temptation that, oh my gosh, binging is what I need somehow. Like my brain and my body made me feel like that was what I needed. So you're in this weird cycle where it harms your life, but then you have these overwhelming urges to do it, as if like, I called it in the book, it almost feels like that's what you need to survive. Like it's a conditioned need. It's not a real need, like for actually like normal amounts of food, but you condition yourself to really feel like you have to binge to survive. So yeah, that went on for about 6 years. And then I eventually found a way to, overcome it. And I don't know if you want me to kind of go into that part or just stop here for now.
Here's a good part for the moment because
Yeah.
what I just want to point out that the way you describe that and that need to binge and feeling like that was for your survival, and then going into the brain science behind it and how that is what your brain is doing, it is trying to help you, is
Yeah.
such a key piece that I think so many people struggling with this don't connect with. And when you connect with that, you can come to a self acceptance and a self compassion that allows the process to be a little gentler and easier to sort of maneuver your way to more balance with it.
Yeah, for sure. Because you ask yourself why? Like, why do I feel this way? Why do I have such this strong desire for something that I know is harming me? It's making me miserable. And I went to therapy and they said it was because of all these different problems, or because I was trying to cope with something, or this need was symbolic of something deeper. And I don't want to say like that there's no connection with binging and emotions, because there are some indirect links. There are some ways it all gets tied together. But in a lot of cases, it starts from that basic need for more food. And you really create that survival response in your primitive part of your brain, which I call the lower brain. and it drives you to eat. And then your brain thinks that's what you need and drives you to maintain the habit, which anyone who has had a habit, addiction, whatever you want to call it, has probably felt that drive to just perform the habit. And it can feel so um, just so powerful and so compelling. So when you have that desire and then you go to therapy and they're like, well, it's because of something in your childhood, or it's because you're sad or lonely or depressed. Like I did a million things to try to cope with sadness and loneliness and depression and anxiety as well. And I still had that massive urge to binge. So none of that like really helped me. And I know it has value for a lot of people, but that wasn't it. It was really the understanding of my brain that helped me have that acceptance, like you talk about, and then eventually overcome it.
Yeah, like really see and understanding how we work as a machine kind
Mm-hmm.
of takes out the blame of like there's something wrong with me that I think keeps us stuck in the cycle of I can't do anything about this.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
if I could only figure out how not to be bored or how not to be sad, then I wouldn't need to binge. But even when I could figure that out, or even when I did feel happy, sometimes I was still overcome by those urges and anxiety and depression and things like that. Like life is hard. And I know, you help people deal with anxiety and help get it more manageable, but it's hard and it's never going to be perfect. So when you think, oh, I have to manage my anxiety perfectly in order to not binge, it's kind of a dangerous setup.
Totally, because then we're like, well, what? Oh no, I'm feeling anxious today. I failed. I can't do
Yeah.
anything. And you're always going to have things in life that make you feel anxious. You're always going to have things in life that make you feel sad. It's how we kind of cope with how hard life is
Yeah,
by
for
having these
sure.
emotions.
Yeah. And I think if you binge sort of at times that you're anxious or times that you're depressed or things like that, then your brain does make that connection. So then maybe the next time you're anxious, your brain produces those urges, but it doesn't mean that you actually need the binge to cope with anxiety. Like you may feel that way in the moment, but you know rationally that the binge actually isn't doing anything to help you. And if you stop binging, you actually can find things and strategies and tools and ways of thinking that actually do help you. But when you just binge, you lose that opportunity to actually find real solutions.
So you had this real epiphany moment, and I love how you described it because it was just so in a way easeful to kind of make that connection after all this like deep work and like you've got to do all this like inner explore your childhood and everything that's so can feel really overwhelming for people to approach
Mhm.
it like that. Can you describe how you moved through to understanding binge eating the way you do now and how you help others overcome that?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll try to condense it a bit, but a book that really helped me, and I like to give credit to Jack Trimpey in Rational Recovery, because it was a book that I found that really turned everything I had learned, turned it all around. Because it basically said, addiction is not a disease. Yes, there's craving. Yes, there's this part of you that feels like you absolutely have to have it, but it's not actually helping you cope. And when you think it's a way to cope, when you think it's a disease, when you think something's wrong with you, it actually makes it worse. So I was like, whoa, like maybe I've been approaching this the wrong way. And what he explains and what I learned is you have basically two brains. You have your lower brain, which he called like the beast brain, and that's in charge of your survival, that's in charge of your habits, that's in charge of your sort of that wanting, the feelings of desire, motivation, things like that. And then you have your more higher rational brain. And this is a simplification, but just general terms, your rational brain, which I call the higher brain or the human brain, is in charge like of your identity and of your just your reasoning power and who you want to be and your goals and actually what you want for your life on that higher level. Your lower brain gets conditioned to like have normal habits that help us in life, but it also can be misguided sometimes because it doesn't really distinguish between good habits and bad habits. So when you give it reinforcement, when you feed it something that is pleasurable, it kind of marks it as necessary for survival. So then it produces this desire. So when you have this and you don't understand it, your rational brain just kind of checks out and goes along with it. But when you really understand that you are separate from that, you are not your primitive brain, you are not these desires, and you can kind of step back from it and observe these cravings and these things that happen in your primal brain, then it gives you the ability to basically not act on it. Um, and I keep saying this, but it is a simplification and there's more. And that's why I have, two books that are 300 pages each. So, if you hear that and you think, oh, if it was that easy, I would have done it already. And no, it's not always that easy. And there's definitely more to it, but this is just to give you a general idea. And well, I'll stop here and ask you, do you have any follow up at this point?
No, feel free to keep going from there. I think that's great.
Yeah, for sure. So when you have these urges that are coming from your primitive brain and you don't understand them, they're so uncomfortable. And you feel like you have to binge or act on really any addiction or habit to make the urges go away because you feel like you can't live in that state of craving. It's just so powerful. So the kind of the big epiphany moment was that I don't binge to cope with problems. I binge to cope with the urges to binge. Like that was the problem. That was what was driving me to binge time after time. It was the only direct cause. So even if there was anxiety, there was the anxiety, then there was an urge, and then there was a binge. Like the anxiety didn't directly cause the binge. So I kind of learned to observe all the thoughts, feelings, physical sensations that encompass the urge. And I learned to see them as not me. I learned to see them as just a product of conditioning, a product of the fact that I had starved myself and I was in this, created this survival reaction to make my brain overly focused on food. And I basically just learned to let these urges pass. And it was interesting because I had tried that before, but it was always like I was trying to let them pass by trying to cope with whatever I thought caused it. So like if I had an urge, I was like, okay, I'm anxious, let me figure out how to solve the anxiety. But it just never made the urges go away. And I basically, when I learned to stop, I also learned to stop trying to make the urges go away by trying to cope with a million things. I just learned to detach from them, allow them to be there, accept their presence, and then let them fade away. And I was like, wow, nothing happened when I didn't act on the urge. I'm still here. Like, and not only am I still here, I'm so much better off for not having binged. Like, I
Yeah.
actually get to live a life today. I don't have to go to the gym for 7 hours, and I don't have to feel miserable, and I don't have like to ride out the discomfort of the urge in that way gave me so many benefits on the other side.
How long does it typically take for an urge to pass?
I do think it's different for everyone. For me, like there were times that it would feel powerful, but it would only last like maybe 5 minutes. And then there would be some nagging thoughts, nagging feelings that would linger, but it was just kind of okay, they're there in the background, but I don't have to turn attention to it. That was a big thing. It was like I could still experience that, but without focusing on it, without fighting it. That was a big thing, like not
Mm.
trying to make them go away. And, they could last, like some people will tell me, oh, it lasts all day. But if you really think about it, like, yeah, it may be kind of buzzing in the background, like a smoker might have that if they stop smoking, but it does fade. And how long that takes is different for everyone. For me, like just my personal experience, the urges were pretty strong and frequent for like 3 weeks. And then they really started to taper off. By 3 months, it was very, so much less intense, so much more manageable, so much more like, oh, that's just my old habit. It's not a big deal. And then they were like completely gone around 9 months, was
Wow.
just my own timeline.
And it sounds very much like you started to connect pleasure to not going through with the binge as well. Like the fact that you could
Yeah.
live your life and enjoy that relief.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was really helpful because I talk about this in the book that really celebrating your success and getting excited about positive things that are happening as a result of not binging, it really cements that learning in your brain. And it's neurologically based in that we praise kids for doing, when they accomplish things. Any sort of praise really tells your brain to mark that as significant and really builds a good habit. And that, so yeah, I think you're definitely right about noticing the benefits, really feeling that success and savoring it really helped cement those changes in my brain.
How do we celebrate when so much we're conditioned to celebrate with food?
Yeah, that's a good point. um I think just noticing the non-food benefits and then also the benefits that have nothing to do with weight. So like I guess I'm going to talk about the weight thing first. I think we're very conditioned to think, oh, I didn't binge, so maybe I lost weight. I think that's not a good path to go down. I think celebrating how not binging helps your life without anything to do with weight is really helpful. Like with your time, your energy, the more time you can focus on your career, the more present you can be for your family or your kids or your friends or whoever is important to you in your life, just your relationships, things like that. Those things are better to focus on than the number on the scale.
Yeah.
As far as the food, like, yeah, people do celebrate with food. And it's interesting because as I'm saying this, I actually think that eating my normal meals was kind of a celebration because I was like, wow, I'm not stuffed and sick. I get to actually enjoy this amazing breakfast. So, like, I don't think it's bad for food to be a celebration a little bit. Like, I could eat dessert without it like getting out of hand. So, that's not a terrible thing. But yeah, there definitely should be other things to celebrate and ways to celebrate, buying yourself something maybe with the money you might have spent on a binge, treating yourself to do something that you enjoy because you're saving the time that you would have spent binging, like things like that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And something I often have women talk to me about is this idea of, well, sometimes when I'm anxious, I overeat, and sometimes when I'm anxious, I don't eat at all. And so there's this, like, as you mentioned, this inconsistent relationship between anxiety and food, which kind of debunks some of that idea that is so helpful to help you, yeah, maneuver through and kind of get to that place of, okay, ultimately I have to jump into my higher brain here and just make that choice.
Yeah, that is a really good point because some people, when they have that anxiety response, it really shuts down the appetite.
Yeah.
And for other people, it really, kind of makes them crave food. So, yes, seeing those inconsistencies, but also finding your own patterns is really important. Like, I do think it's important to notice, hey, when I'm anxious, I might get urges. And that doesn't mean you have to totally solve the anxiety at all. But you can just be aware that, hey, if I'm in this situation that I know is going to produce anxiety, I might need to be aware. Might need to expect my brain to act up, I guess is something you could call it. I need to expect these thoughts and feelings to come and maybe even give yourself a plan of something you could do. And, doing distracting activities and things, that's not going to get rid of the urge, but it just gives you a sense of power to know that, hey, I can focus on something else, even though I'm having these sort of buzzing thoughts and feelings going on in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we can kind of see, would you say that when we're in an anxious state, that it can be more challenging to overcome the urge, or is it irrelevant?
That's a really good point. I think that it's not irrelevant, but I think the more we tell ourselves that it's so much harder when I'm anxious, it does kind of put my brain in a depleted state. Therefore, it's going to be harder for me. I think the more we say that, like, it's kind of self-fulfilling sometimes. But that being said, so you really want to have that sense of empowerment. Like, I can feel anxious and still not binge. Yes, it might take some more effort, but you can do it. So that's like the first thing is like empower yourself to realize you can do it. Now, I also want people to be very compassionate with themselves and realize that, hey, if you have this time of being really anxious, if you do go into that automatic behavior, it doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean that you can't overcome this. So, like, be compassionate with yourself and realize that when you are in an anxious state, it does kind of deplete your self-control a little bit. It's not gone, but the more anxious we are, the more likely we are to jump into habitual behaviors and automatic behaviors and whatever we're conditioned to do. When we're more calm and relaxed, it's easier to use that rational, higher human brain. So, would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. There's an idea that we need to be ready to make a change like this, especially when you're in a cycle like binge eating that does feel very cyclical. How do you find that in the people you work with, Kathryn, and your experience too? Is it that we have to reach this moment where we're so rock bottom that we're finally ready, or can we make that change at any time?
Yeah, you asked really good questions. I will say that is a good one because I think some people do feel that way. Like, hey, I have to be ready, whether that means I need to solve something first, I need to reorganize something in my life, or it means like you said, oh, I've hit rock bottom, so now I have no choice type of thing. Um, I think it can kind of be sort of both ways in that, yes, maybe there are some things some people need to do to be, quote, ready. But if we get stuck there, you can kind of get in this cycle where you're never going to be ready. Like, because there will always be something you could find as a, I hate to say excuse because I know people aren't, trying to make excuses, but it is tempting to say, okay, I'll just solve this first because it's a challenge to conquer a habit. So if we can point to something in our life and say, oh, I'm just not ready, let me sort this out first, you can kind of delay recovery for a long time. So I do think people, for the most part, are a lot more ready than they realize just because there will never be a perfect time. Like that's sort of another pattern that the brain does is it says tomorrow, or, it pushes off any sort of thing that's going to require time, effort, energy, discomfort. It pushes that into the future. So
Yeah.
you'll have those thoughts. It's normal. That's why people always think, oh, I'll do this one last time. That's like the most common thought. I feel like that leads to a binge, one last time, and then I'll start. So you could follow that forever. So eventually you have to just say, okay, you know, if there is something that I need to solve, I'm going to get to work on solving it, and then I'll stop the binging. Like if there's something specific, I think it's fine, but like really focus on stopping the binging as like your main priority. I feel like I got a little lost there. Maybe you could edit,
No,
but
that totally makes sense. Totally makes sense.
yeah, like totally solve something if you need to, but don't get stuck there.
Yeah. And where I think a lot of people can get stuck is in the aftermath of the binge, that overwhelming guilt that
Mm-hmm.
comes in. And it's pretty much part and parcel with the whole experience is the guilt that washes over. What kind of tips or advice do you have for being in that guilt? Or like, let's say you've just binged and you're in that place.
Yeah, it's interesting because I just am going to release a podcast this week that addresses that very thing.
Ah,
It's called Post-binge Brain, and it's episode number 109, and it's coming out. So by the time this show comes out, that will be there as episode 109 on the Brain Over Binge podcast. And the coach that helps people for Brain Over Binge coach, her name is Julie Mann, and she does our Brain Over Binge group and one-on-one coaching. And she coined this term, post-binge brain, and it is like the state that you're in after a binge. And sorry, I got my phone is making noise. Okay,
oh,
I'm
that's
gonna
okay.
just go
We'll
back.
edit that bit out.
So post binge brain is the state that you're in after a binge, and there's physiological reasons for it. It's a very mentally draining state. It's a very low state. It's often filled with a lot of hopeless thoughts like, oh, I can never do this. Something's wrong with me. Like, why do I keep doing this? And I mean, I don't want to say it's normal, but like if you have experienced this, you are not alone. Like anyone who's ever binged, like it's very natural for you to end up there. But I think it's really, really important to remember that, again, you don't have to stay stuck there. This is a state that will pass. And because it does feel so awful, like your brain naturally brings you back to wanting recovery again. I remember when I would get in this state, this post binge state, like I would think, oh, I'm going to be here forever. But then within a day or so, I would start being like, gosh, I really want to live. I really want to recover. Of course, the things I was doing at the time weren't really helping, but it will pass. So that's an important thing to remember and to take care of yourself during this time. I think the temptation is to like want to punish yourself, want to restrict more, want to, like I did, over exercise. That's not going to help. That only served to perpetuate it in myself and serves to perpetuate the cycle in other people. So really, committing to not purging, to taking care of yourself, to, eat nourishing foods, not to restrict. And that will help bring you back to your more rational state where you do want recovery. And then you can start using whatever works and whatever support you need in order to keep going toward a binge free life.
It is fascinating how much of a cycle there is to the binge eating process. Like
Mhm.
you really move through these stages, and you mentioned there's the optimism on the other side that you sort of launch into. Perhaps that's a good time to make some positive changes and be in that ready place and start to change things versus the guilt laden like post binge I've got to like, oh my god, overwhelmingly solve my entire life kind of place. um
Yeah.
do you think, Kathryn, there's something empowering just by really understanding and knowing that cycle?
Yeah, I do think so because I think it allows you not to think something's wrong with you.
Mm.
Like, because if you think, oh, that's only me that's doing this is only my problem. But when you see it's sort of universal among everyone who gets stuck in this habit, then you think, okay, this is just what my brain does. There's this cycle of optimism, and then the urges come because that's the habit, and then you act on them because you don't really know where they're coming from and you don't know how to resist them, and then you binge, and then of course it feels exciting for the first very short time, and then you realize, oh my god, it's not what I wanted to do, and there's so much guilt, and that lasts a while, and then there's optimism again. But I do think, like you said, in that phase of optimism, and of course there's things you can do in other phases as well to help yourself, but when you do have that desire to recover resurface, really using that time to figure out what works for you and what's going to help you. In my approach, I try to simplify it as much as possible for people because, like I talked about, there's so much out there of you need to solve this and anxiety and depression, and like you have to eat all these special foods and things like that. I mean, it can seem completely overwhelming. So in my approach, there's two goals of recovery. It's just dismiss the urges to binge and eat adequately. And adequately is like I say in my second book, The Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide, adequately is like such a boring word, but it's like you don't need to eat optimally, ideally, healthy all the time. Like you just have to eat enough nourishing food, get your basic macronutrients, micronutrients, get your basic food groups, make sure you're getting enough food. And it doesn't have to be perfect ever. So those two goals, and then, dismissing the urges to binge, the first goal, that's what rewires your brain. When you have those urges, when you don't act on them, you're teaching your brain, this is not what I need. Going back to sort of the beginning when I talked about my story and feeling that overwhelming need, if you can have those feelings of need and want and not act on them, you eventually stop having that desire because your brain does learn. I mean, it's amazing to learn about neuroplasticity, which I talk about in the book, that your brain just can rewire itself. And that's super empowering, but it can't be done if you're restricting food. So that's why both of those goals, to dismiss the urges and to eat adequately, both of those are necessary in order for the brain to change and in order for you just to get back to living.
I just want to add too on that adequately boring word, just how powerful and important that is. Because I remember when I was first studying nutrition, one of the things one of my favorite lecturers said was, balance or adequate or all of those
Mm-hmm.
like eat moderately. They don't sell books. Like those kind of terms
No.
don't get people like, oh my God, this is a bestseller. What sells books? It's like paleo, cut this
Mm-hmm.
out, completely like get rid of gluten, like all of these things that are more extreme. And I always think you're more closer to what's really going to help you, the more boring the advice is in the sense of more moderate, balanced, rational, reasonable, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, which is different for everyone. No one's way of eating is going to look the same.
Exactly.
And when you know and you just have to eat adequately, then there's no rules, there's no, specific plan you have to follow. That's for you to discover. And I found that's what helps people the most when it's a way of eating that comes from them. And it may not look the same like when you're first starting recovery as it does years down the road, but that's what's so great about it is you can always adapt it, you can always change it, you can always add or figure out what works best for you and listen to your body. So yeah, I mean, it's just very open ended, but I think it's super important, and it leaves room for, if you do need nutritional support, like totally, like eating disorders can deplete your body of necessary nutrients, and some people do need extra help in that area to heal themselves.
Yeah, for sure. How do you feel about the idea of intuitive eating?
That's a big topic too. It is. I have a few things I've written on that. actually don't remember the podcast episodes, but if you go to like brainoverbinge.com and you type in intuitive eating, then you'll find some blog posts and things I've done over the years about that, because I think it's good. Like, and I say that, and I'm not, it sounds a little hesitant when I say that, but I don't think it's like the cure for binging. You know, people think I have to learn to eat intuitively to stop binging. But like that almost becomes a rule. That almost becomes like, I have to wait till I'm hungry to eat. And oh my gosh, I ate when I wasn't quite hungry yet. And this wasn't really what I wanted. Well, guess what? Most people don't get to eat exactly what they want all the time. Like life is busy, life is hard. You can't always just follow your body. Like, yeah, it's great advice to learn your hunger and fullness and preferences. That's all wonderful advice, but sometimes it doesn't quite line up with reality. So like if you have to eat before you go into a meeting, like that's okay. Like you have to kind of line up your eating with your schedule. Sometimes some people do work better with a more structured approach, especially at first, because binging and dieting can sort of mess up your hunger and fullness signals, where so that they're not completely reliable. So intuitive eating is like listen to your body, and some former binge eaters or recovering binge eaters are like, well, how do I listen to my body? It's telling me to binge and it's telling me to restrict. And sometimes your thoughts and feelings surrounding food aren't completely reliable, so you have to use that more rational part of yourself. But then later on you can start to get more in touch. So you might need like a structured approach at first and then go into a more intuitive approach later. So, there's just different ways that intuitive eating can be incorporated into recovery, but it's not like a one size fits all for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's amazing and so, so important. It sounds like removing the judgment as best as you can on yourself, like really that self compassion piece. It's like, today I ate when I wasn't hungry. That's okay. Today I ate a food that part of me might label bad or unhealthy. That's okay. Like, it's all okay. And none of it needs to come with judgment because that's only going to kind of like, yeah, it's not helpful.
Yeah, totally
Yeah.
agree.
So, are there any specific mindsets or attitudes that you see that in the people that you work with and help that sort of leads them to a more effortless, not that it's effortless, but or a more easeful experience through working with their binge eating versus others that might say struggle a little more or not get the results that they want?
A
What sets
big
us up
thing.
for success? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's a good question too. And I think the avoidance of dieting, or maybe the willingness to let go of dieting, is super important. It may not be easy, but I think people who are so set on like, I'm going to be the exception, I'm going to stop binging and have the perfect body and follow this meal plan exactly, eat paleo or whatever. I mean, different ways of eating work for different people. And I'm not saying that's always a terrible thing to eat in a certain way if that's what works for you. But people who really, really hang on to the restriction, I feel like keep falling back into the binging. It's just like you said, a cycle. So when people have a mindset of acceptance of their body, acceptance of where their weight may end up, where they sort of let go of the control, those people are who do the best. And over time, like their weight does find its natural place. Like it's not like, oh, those people do the best and they end up way over their natural weight. No, those people actually, the metabolisms can heal and they find their body may not end up the like it might end up like what they ideally may want it to be in a perfect world, but it ends up in a peaceful place that doesn't require constant effort to maintain and trying to control it and then losing control. So I do think, yeah, the willingness to let go of dieting and the body acceptance and weight acceptance is the people who do the best.
That's such a huge, I think, barrier that holds people back too, is that fear. What if I blow up? What if I put on so much weight and it's just completely out of my control? And then no one loves me and I'm just a reject in society.
Yeah. And the thing I tell people a lot is just like if you do kind of the basic math, and weight is definitely not a math equation, but when you binge and then you restrict and diet and do all these things, you're still probably eating more calories than if you were just to eat a normal diet. People think, oh, I can't possibly eat adequately. I can't possibly eat that much food. I'm like, but you're actually eating more when you're binging and restricting. So eating an adequate amount is actually going to give your body less food. And even if you purge, because purging, there's still calories absorbed. So like sort of that rational argument against it can help, and just kind of showing people the result that it's having in their lives beyond weight. I mean, it's really letting go, like I talked about earlier, noticing the benefits that have nothing to do with weight, and just seeing that it's not a sustainable way to maintain weight. I mean, it's just not. Like, there's studies that show that when people reach their highest weights ever while bulimic, like they don't lose weight. Even if there's some initial weight loss, it's not an effective form of weight control.
Yeah, so true. This really cute example just like popped into my head about if we can see our body as like a little child, and we, with our higher brain, are the adult here, and you think about like giving this child a stable home, how much more is that child going to flourish? So stable meals, consistent meals versus the drama and the chaos of like binge restrict, which is like the idea of like giving love and then taking it away, and all the stuff that can lead to so much trauma and negative beliefs and things later in life. It might be a helpful concept for people too, just seeing your body as a child,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love that. It's great because we're just so mean to ourselves sometimes, and all of us are guilty of it, but we would never treat someone else that way. A child, a friend, like think of yourself, like how would you treat that other person, and then treat yourself the same way.
Yeah, so beautiful. Kathryn, I appreciate your time so much. It's been such a wonderful thing to finally speak with you after following your work for so many years. I'd love to know, for everyone who's listening, where can we find you? You mentioned your podcast. How can we keep in touch?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And to find me, you can go to brainoverbinge.com. That's the easiest place. I have my books there, the podcast, blog, my course. I have an online course. I have coaching, group coaching, like I mentioned earlier. And yeah, total. That's just the best place to learn more about me. So thank you so much.
Fabulous. We'll pop all that in the show notes so people can find it nice and easily. Thank you so much, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Has this episode left you wanting more? Consider joining the Anxiety Reset program. I'll be there supporting you live each month, and weekly videos take you through simple steps that you can implement at your own pace. Over 90 days, we reprogram your mind to reduce negative thinking, release the need to be perfect, build confidence, feel okay with uncertainty, and finally let go. You'll create deep relaxation and calm by addressing your gut health, hormones, nutrition, and more all in one. You really can master your anxious mind. Let's do it together. Learn more with the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening. We have reached the end of this episode. If you enjoy this podcast and you find it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit subscribe or share this episode on your Instagram stories, and make sure you tag @Georgie the Naturopath. But that is all for today. Please be kind to yourselves. Know that you are enough and you are exactly where you need to be.